Okay, good morning, guys. So hopefully you're in live class and you've already put your RTL responses in the chat so you can get your participation points. If you are not in live class, you're watching the pre-recorded video, make sure to pause the video now, go back, go through the RTL first so that you're set up mentally for the learning target. Everybody else, let's get to the learning target. I will be able to identify arguments in favor of and against women's suffrage. So obviously our new term in this target is going to be suffrage. And suffrage is actually a really easy vocabulary word. It just means the right to vote. The right to vote. So if suffrage means the right to vote, and women's obviously relates to women, women's suffrage is going to be a woman's right to vote. A woman's right to vote. In this country, women did not receive the right to vote until 1920, towards the end of the Progressive era. Progressive era. Remember that during the Progressive era, lots of change, lots of reform. Remember, change means reform. Lots of changes, lots of reforms were made. The Progressive era followed, I'm gonna get a new color now. The Progressive era followed industrialization. And a lot of the changes that happened during the Progressive era were made to fix what happened during industrialization. Now in your RTL, it asked you to think about the different changes that people fought for during the Progressive era. So you might want to think back to our muckrakers now while you were brainstorming those changes. You might have said people fought to end child labor, end child labor. If you're thinking back to Friday's lesson on labor unions, you might think unions wanted safer working conditions, safer work. They wanted higher pay. There were lots of changes that people fought for during the Progressive era. Alongside these changes was women's suffrage, a woman's right to vote. So tomorrow, as we continue to study changes made during the Progressive era, one thing we're going to be thinking about is not only the types of changes that happened in factories or to improve cities, but also more general changes that were meant to improve our democracy. So right now I've got a video that I want to show you that gives you a nice timeline of voting rights in the United States. Right after that video, I'm going to explain the activity for today. And the activity is going to look different depending on if you're in live class or if you're watching the pre-recorded video. Okay, so here's a video that gives us a nice timeline of voting rights in America.
When the next general election rolls around, who will be eligible to show up at the polls and vote for the President of the United States? It's really pretty simple. If you are at least 18 years old, a citizen of the US, and a resident of a state, you can vote, assuming that is you're not a felon. Seems about right. After all, the United States prides itself on being a democracy, or a government in which the ultimate authority lies with the citizens of the nation. But it was not always this way. In 1789, George Washington won the Electoral College with 100% of the vote. But whose vote was it? Probably not yours. Only 6% of the entire United States population was allowed to vote at all. Voting was a right that only white male property owners were allowed to exercise. By the 1820s and 1830s, the American population was booming from the East Coast into the Western frontier. Frontier farmers were resilient, self-reliant, and mostly ineligible to vote because they did not own land. As these new areas of the nation became states, they typically left out the property requirement for voting. Leaders such as Andrew Jackson, the United States' first common man president, promoted what he called universal suffrage. Of course, by universal suffrage, Jackson really meant universal white male suffrage. All he emphasized was getting rid of the property requirement for voting, not expanding the vote beyond white men. By the 1850s, about 55% of the adult population was eligible to vote in the US, much better than 6%, but far from everybody. Then, in 1861, the American Civil War began largely over the issue of slavery and states' rights in the United States. When it was all over, the US ratified the 15th Amendment, which promised that a person's right to vote could not be denied based on race, color, or previous condition as a slave. This meant that Black men, newly affirmed as citizens of the US, would now be allowed to vote. Of course, laws are far from reality. Despite the promise of the 15th Amendment, intimidation kept African Americans from exercising their voting rights. States passed laws that limited the rights of African Americans to vote, including things like literacy tests, which were rigged so that not even literate African Americans were allowed to pass, and poll taxes. So despite the 15th Amendment, by 1892, only about 6% of Black men in Mississippi were registered to vote. By 1960, it was only 1%. And of course, women were still totally out of the national voting picture. It wasn't until 1920 that the women's suffrage movement won their 30-year battle, and the 19th Amendment finally gave women the vote. Well, white women. The restrictions on African Americans, including African American women, remained. After World War II, many Americans began to question the state of US democracy. How could a nation that fought for freedom and human rights abroad come home and deny suffrage based on race? The modern civil rights movement began in the 1940s with those questions in mind. After years of sacrifice, bloodshed, and pain, the United States passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, finally eliminating restrictions such as literacy tests and protecting the voting rights promised under the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, any citizen over the age of 21 could vote. All seemed well, until the United States went to war. When the Vietnam War called up all men aged 18 and over for the draft, many wondered whether it was fair to send men who couldn't vote to war. In 1971, the 26th Amendment to the Constitution made all citizens 18 and older eligible to vote, the last major expansion of voting rights in the United States. Today, the pool of eligible voters in the US is far broader and more inclusive than ever before in US history. But of course, it's not perfect. There are still active efforts to suppress some groups from voting, and only about 60% of those who can vote do. Now that you know all the hard work that went into securing the right to vote, what do you think? Do enough citizens have the right to vote now? And among those who can vote, why don't more of them do it?
So there were a lot of different reasons why people supported women's suffrage, women's right to vote during the Progressive era. There were also a lot of reasons that people were against women's suffrage, a woman's right to vote, during the Progressive era. In this period of so much change, it makes sense that a big change like women's suffrage, excuse me, sorry guys, it makes sense that a big issue like women's suffrage would be passed. Our job today is to figure out arguments. What were the different arguments in favor of, the pros? What were the different arguments in favor of and against, the cons, women's suffrage? And you're going to do that through an interview activity. If you're in live class, if you're watching the pre-recorded video, you're doing it on your own. Here's what you are doing. So to figure out arguments in favor of and against women's suffrage, you're going to scroll to your second page where it says Women's Suffrage Interviews Graphic Organizer. Directions. Pick 5 of the profiles, meaning descriptions of people, on the following page. Identify whether each person was in favor of or against women's suffrage and explain why in the third column. If you are in live class, you will be interviewing each other to fill in this graphic organizer. If you are not in live class, you will have to complete all 5 rows of this graphic organizer independently. So on the third page, starting on the third page, you'll see a number of profiles. Your job is to read each profile, each description of a person. So number 1 is Susan B. Anthony, and then fill in your graphic organizer accordingly. So that first column, profile number, asks for the number on the profile. You'll see at the top, there's a number on each profile. So I'm just going to put number 1 here as an example. Then in the second column, it asks for the name on the profile. So the name on the first profile, on profile 1, would be Susan B. Anthony. So I'm going to write her name, Susan B. Anthony. Oops. Finally, in that third column, it asks, is this person in favor of or against women's suffrage? Why? Explain in 2 to 3 sentences. Based on what you read in Susan B. Anthony's profile, you would then answer the questions in the third column. Make sure to explain why. Thanks, guys.